He had the highest security clearance the US government could grant. He had just returned from saving American lives overseas. But to ICE agent William Rowley, Navy SEAL Sebastian Dawson was just another suspect who didn't look like he belonged. Rowley ignored the military ID. He ignored the calm warnings. He thought he was detaining a nobody. He didn't realize he had just declared war on the United States Navy. This is the story of the traffic stop that brought the federal government to its knees. The Texas highway stretched out like a ribbon of black tar under a sky so wide it made Sebastian Dawson feel small for the first time in months. Out there, in the sand and the blood, and the screaming chaos of Kandahar, the world had been compressed into tight corridors and kill zones. Here, the emptiness was almost offensive in its peace. He rolled down the window of his Ford F-150, letting the dry heat slap against his face. It smelled like dust and mesquite, nothing like the acrid burn of cordite and diesel that had been his cologne for the past 4 months. His hands rested easy on the wheel, but his knuckles were still scabbed over from where he'd punched through a door to drag a wounded Marine out of a collapsing building. The docs had wanted to keep him another week for observation. Sebastian had politely declined. He'd done his time in sterile rooms with fluorescent lights. He wanted a steak, a cold beer, and his daughter's laugh echoing through his living room. The mission replayed in fragments behind his eyes, the way Corporal Jenkins had looked at him when Sebastian pulled him from the rubble, eyes wide with the kind of gratitude that made a man's throat tight. The weight of the rifle in his hands as he'd held the perimeter while the medevac bird came in hot. The silence after, when the adrenaline drained and left only the ringing in his ears and the knowledge that 3 families would get their sons back because he'd done his job. He'd done a lot of jobs. 17 years in the teams would do that. He had the scars to prove it, the clearances that made bureaucrats nervous, and a service record that read like a redacted thriller novel. But right now, he was just a man driving home, thinking about whether his grill still worked, and if his ex-wife had remembered to tell their daughter he was coming back early. The rearview mirror flashed red and blue. Sebastian's eyes flicked up, his pulse barely registering the change. Muscle memory from 1,000 ambushes kept his breathing steady. Probably a speed trap. He glanced at the speedometer, 63 in a 65. He hadn't been weaving. His tags were current, his inspection sticker was fresh. The cruiser behind him wasn't slowing down to pass. It was riding his bumper, close enough that Sebastian could see the silhouette of the driver, aggressive and impatient. The siren chirped once, sharp and demanding. Sebastian sighed and flipped on his turn signal, easing the truck onto the shoulder. Dust kicked up in a lazy cloud as he rolled to a stop. He put the truck in park, killed the engine, and placed both hands on the wheel at 10 and 2. Old habit. The kind that kept black men alive during traffic stops, even when they had top-secret clearance and a chest full of medals locked in a box at home. The cruiser door slammed. Heavy boots crunched gravel. Sebastian watched in the side mirror as the figure approached, and something in his gut tightened. The walk was wrong, too aggressive, too eager. This wasn't a bored highway patrol officer looking to fill a quota. This was someone looking for a fight. The man who appeared at his window wore an ICE uniform, the badge glinting in the late afternoon sun. He was stocky, red-faced, with the kind of moustache that screamed overcompensation. His hand rested on his sidearm, her fingers drumming against the holster like he was itching to draw. "License and registration," the agent barked. No greeting. No explanation. Sebastian kept his hands visible, his voice calm. "Afternoon, officer. Can I ask why I was pulled over?" The agent's eyes narrowed. "You can ask. Doesn't mean I have to answer. License, registration, now. Sebastian moved slowly, deliberately, reaching for the glove box. I'm going to reach for my documents now. My military ID is in my wallet. Military ID, the agent repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. He leaned closer, and Sebastian caught the faint smell of coffee and something sour. Sure it is. Let's see it. Sebastian handed over his driver's license, registration, and the small black card that identified him as an active-duty Navy SEAL with clearances that would make most federal agents sweat. The agent snatched them from his hand, barely glancing at the military ID before tossing it onto the dirt beside the truck. Nice try, the agent said, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. Cheap forgery. Step out of the vehicle. Sebastian's jaw tightened. He looked at his ID lying in the dust, the eagle and trident catching the light, and felt the first cold thread of understanding coil in his chest. This wasn't a traffic stop. This was something else entirely. Sebastian didn't move. Not yet. His hand stayed on the wheel, his voice level and measured. Agent, that's a valid military identification card. I'm an active-duty Navy SEAL returning from deployment. If you'll just verify. I said step out of the vehicle. The agent's hand moved to his holster, unsnapping the retention strap. His name tag read Rowley in block letters. Don't make me repeat myself. Sebastian's training kicked in, the kind that had kept him alive in rooms full of hostiles who actually wanted him dead. Assess. De-escalate. Survive. He could see the tremor in Rowley's hand, the way his pupils were dilated despite the bright sun. This man was afraid, and fear made people dangerous in ways that malice never could. I'm complying, Sebastian said, reaching slowly for the door handle. I'm going to step out now. I'm not armed. He opened the door and stepped onto the shoulder, his boots crunching on gravel. He was 6'2", 200 pounds of muscle earned through hell weeks and combat deployments. Rowley took an involuntary step back, then seemed to catch himself, puffing his chest out like a rooster trying to reclaim territory. Turn around. Hands on the vehicle. Sebastian turned, placing his palms flat on the sun-hot metal of his truck. Behind him, he heard Rowley's radio crackle. This is Unit 7. I've got a suspicious individual, possible undocumented, requesting backup. Agent Rowley, Sebastian said, keeping his voice calm. I'm a United States Navy SEAL. My ID is on the ground next to your boot. If you'll just pick it up and run it through your system. Shut up. Rowley kicked the ID further into the dirt. You think I'm stupid? Do you think I don't know a fake when I see one? Where'd you get it, huh? Some chop shop in Juarez? Sebastian closed his eyes for a moment, counting to 5. He'd faced down insurgents with AKs and suicide vests. He'd jumped out of planes at 30,000 feet into hostile territory. He'd held his brothers while they bled out waiting for medevac. And now he was being called a liar by a man who probably couldn't pass the first day of BUD/S. I'm asking you respectfully to verify my credentials, Sebastian said. Call Naval Special Warfare Command. Call JSOC. Hell, call the Pentagon. But you need to verify before this goes somewhere neither of us wants. Rowley grabbed Sebastian's wrist, wrenching it behind his back with more force than necessary. The cuffs bit into his skin, cold metal against the scars from old shrapnel wounds. The only place this is going is processing. You're being detained under suspicion of illegal entry into the United States. Sebastian's other hand was yanked back, cuffed tight enough to cut circulation. He didn't resist. Couldn't. Not without turning this into an assault on a federal officer, which would bury him regardless of who was right. But every instinct screamed at him to move, to break the hold, to end this with the efficiency he'd been trained to deploy. You're making a mistake, Sebastian said quietly. The only mistake here is you thinking you could roll through my checkpoint with fake papers and a sob story." Rowley spun him around, shoving him against the truck. "Where are you really from? Guatemala? Honduras? You speak English pretty good for an illegal." Something cold settled in Sebastian's chest. Not anger. And anger was hot and stupid and got you killed. This was the ice-water calm that came before a mission. The clarity that let him put rounds through targets at 1,000 yards. He looked Rowley dead in the eyes. "I'm from Detroit," Sebastian said. "I enlisted when I was 18. I've served in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and places you don't have clearance to know about. I've saved American lives. I've taken enemy lives. And right now, you're detaining a service member with TS/SCI clearance without cause or verification." Rowley's face flushed red. "You threatening me? I'm warning you." "Yeah?" Rowley grabbed Sebastian by the arm, dragging him toward the cruiser. "Here's my warning. You're going to a holding cell, and then you're going back to whatever hole you crawled out of. And that fake ID. That's federal charges. Who, buddy?" Sebastian let himself be shoved into the back of the cruiser, his head ducking just in time to avoid the door frame. Through the window, he could see his truck sitting on the shoulder, his military ID still lying in the dirt like a discarded piece of trash. Rowley slammed the door and walked back to retrieve the ID. He picked it up, glanced at it once more, then tossed it onto the passenger seat, like it was evidence in a case he'd already closed in his mind. As the cruiser pulled back onto the highway, Sebastian sat in silence, his wrists aching, his jaw tight. He wasn't afraid. Fear was for people who didn't know what came next. Sebastian knew exactly what came next, and William Rowley had no idea what he'd just started. The processing center smelled like sweat, disinfectant, and desperation. Sebastian was marched through a side entrance, past a waiting room full of families, clutching papers and crying children, into a sterile hallway that could have been any government building in America. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere, a phone rang unanswered. Rowley shoved him toward a desk where a tired-looking woman in a CBP uniform sat behind plexiglass. She didn't look up from her computer. "Another one," Rowley announced, like he was delivering a package. "No valid documentation, fake military ID, probably part of a smuggling ring." The woman's eyes flicked up, then to Sebastian, then back to her screen. "Name?" "Sebastian Dawson," he said clearly. "Service number?" "He doesn't have a service number," Rowley interrupted. He's got a fake ID and a story. Process him." The woman sighed, the kind of sigh that spoke of too many hours and not enough pay. "Empty your pockets. Everything on the counter." Sebastian complied. Wallet, keys to his truck, his phone, which Rowley snatched up immediately, a folded $20 bill, a receipt from a gas station in El Paso, and around his neck, hanging against his chest beneath his shirt, his dog tags. Rowley noticed them when Sebastian pulled them out. The agent's lip curled. "Those fake too?" Sebastian said nothing. The tags were worn smooth in places, the stamped letters still legible. Dawson, Sebastian J. His service number. His blood type, O positive. The same blood he'd left in 3 different countries. "Let me guess," Rowley continued, warming to his audience of one bored clerk. Bought those at a surplus store. Thought they'd make your story more believable." Sebastian met his eyes. "Those tags have been with me for 17 years. They've been in firefights you can't imagine. They've been covered in blood that wasn't mine and blood that was. You want to mock them? That's your choice. But they're real. And so am I." Rowley leaned in close enough that Sebastian could smell the coffee on his breath. "You know what I think? I think you're a con artist who got too cocky, and now you're going to sit in a cell until we figure out which country to send you back to." The clerk pushed a plastic bin across the counter. "Everything except the tags goes in here. You'll get it back when you're released or deported." Sebastian placed his belongings in the bin, but kept the dog tags around his neck. The clerk didn't argue. Rowley looked like he wanted to, but another officer called his name from down the hall, and he stalked off with a final glare. 2 guards led Sebastian deeper into the facility, through a heavy door, down another hallway, past holding rooms where he could hear voices in Spanish, in what might have been Haitian Creole, in languages he didn't recognize. The guards stopped at a reinforced door with a small window. One of them unlocked it. "Inside." The cell was maybe 20 by 20, with concrete walls painted institutional beige and a single toilet in the corner that offered no privacy. There were already 15 people inside, maybe more. Men, women, a teenage boy who couldn't have been more than 16. They sat on benches bolted to the walls or on the floor, and their faces carrying the exhausted weight of people who'd been waiting too long for answers that might never come. The door clanged shut behind Sebastian. A few heads turned, assessed him, then looked away. He found a spot against the back wall and slid down to sit, his cuffed hands resting on his knees. The metal bit into his wrists. He ignored it. Time moved strangely in the cell. Could have been an hour. Could have been 3. Sebastian watched the others, reading their body language the way he'd been trained to read a room before breaching it. The woman near the door was crying silently, her shoulders shaking. The teenage boy was trying to look tough, but his hands wouldn't stop trembling. An older man was praying quietly, his lips moving around words Sebastian couldn't hear. The door opened again, and a guard shoved another man inside, this one wild-eyed and shouting in Spanish. He stumbled, caught himself, then started pacing like a caged animal. His panic was contagious. The teenager stood up, fists clenched. The crying woman's sobs got louder. Sebastian stood slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. He walked to the center of the cell and spoke, his voice cutting through the rising chaos without being loud. "Everyone breathe." The pacing man stopped, staring at him. The teenager sat back down. "I know you're scared," Sebastian continued. "I know this feels like the end. But panic doesn't help. Panic gets people hurt. So we're going to stay calm. We're going to stay quiet. And we're going to get through this." The older man looked up from his prayers. "Who are you?" Sebastian touched his dog tags, at the metal warm against his palm. "Someone who's been in worse places than this." It wasn't much, but it was enough. The tension in the cell eased, just a fraction. People settled back into their waiting, and Sebastian leaned against the wall, closed his eyes, and began counting the minutes until someone, somewhere, realized he was missing. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hawk Hawkins checked his watch for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The briefing room at Naval Special Warfare Group 2 was half empty, most of the team still scattered across 3 continents on various rotations. But the ones who mattered were here. The ones who'd bled with Sebastian Dawson in places that didn't exist on any official map. "He should have checked in 6 hours ago," Hawk said, his voice tight. Petty Officer First Class Jamie Chen looked up from her laptop, her fingers still flying across the keyboard. "Could be he's sleeping. Man just got back from 4 months of hell. Maybe he turned his phone off." "Dawes doesn't turn his phone off." That came from Chief Petty Officer Ray Preacher Williams, who sat with his arms crossed, his jaw working a piece of gum like it had personally offended him. Not when he knows we're waiting on confirmation he made it home. Protocol is protocol." Hawk nodded. Protocol existed for a reason. When you operated in the shadows, When your missions were scrubbed from official records before the ink dried, you developed systems, check-ins, code words, ways to know your brothers were alive and safe. Sebastian had been wheels down at Fort Hood 12 hours ago. He should have called from the road, should have sent the text that meant he was clear and heading home to Detroit. Radio silence from a SEAL wasn't just unusual. It was a red flag soaked in gasoline. "Chen, pull his location," Hawk ordered. Her fingers danced across the keys. "On it. Accessing his phone's GPS now." A pause. "Got it. Last ping was 8 hours ago. Texas State Highway 77, at about 40 miles north of the border. And then nothing? Phone went dark, either powered off or destroyed." Preacher sat forward. The gum chewing stopped. "His truck." Chen switched screens. Every vehicle assigned to or owned by active SEALs had a tracker embedded in the frame. Insurance policy in case of kidnapping, which was a very real threat for operators with their faces on enemy kill lists. "Truck's still pinging, same location, hasn't moved in 8 hours. The room went quiet. Hawk felt the cold weight settle in his gut, the same feeling he got 30 seconds before a mission went sideways. "Where exactly is that truck?" Chen zoomed in on the map. The blue dot sat stationary on a satellite image of a low-slung concrete building surrounded by chain-link fence and razor wire. She clicked for details, and the name popped up in block letters. "Ice Processing and Detention Center, Laredo South." Preacher was on his feet before she finished the sentence. "You're telling me Dawes is at an ice facility?" "His truck is," Chen corrected. "Can't confirm he's there without—" "He's there." Hawk's voice was flat, certain. "His phone dies at the same location his truck stops moving, right outside a federal detention center. He's inside." "That doesn't make sense," Chen said, but her face said she knew it made perfect sense. They'd all heard the stories, seen the news reports, veterans detained at the border, citizens held for hours or days because they had the wrong skin color or the wrong last name, or because some power-drunk agent decided they looked suspicious. But this was different. This wasn't some reservist or a retired grunt. This was an active duty SEAL with clearances that made senators nervous. Hawk pulled out his phone and dialed a number from memory. It rang twice before a crisp voice answered. "JSOC Operations. This is Lieutenant Commander Hawkins, SEAL Team 2. I need to report a potential compromise of a high-value asset." There was a pause. "Go ahead." "Petty Officer Sebastian Dawson, TS/SCI clearance. Last known location is an ICE detention facility in Laredo. He missed his check-in 8 hours ago. His phone is dark and his vehicle is stationary at the facility. I'm requesting immediate verification of his status and location." Another pause, longer this time. Hawk could hear keys clicking in the background. "Stand by." The seconds stretched. Preacher paced. Chen pulled up every database she had access to, looking for any record of Sebastian's detention. Hawk waited, his jaw tight, his mind already running through scenarios. Best case, this was a misunderstanding that would be cleared up with a phone call. Worst case. "Commander Hawkins." The voice on the phone had changed, sharper now, more senior. "This is Colonel Vance, JSOC. Confirm you said Petty Officer Dawson is being held at a civilian detention facility." "Affirmative, sir." "Jesus Christ." It was barely a whisper, but Hawk heard it clearly. "Stand by for orders. Do not, I repeat, do not approach that facility until we have a full picture. Understood?" "Understood, sir." The line went dead. Hawk looked at his team. Preacher's face was stone. Chen had stopped typing, her hands frozen over the keyboard. "They took one of ours," Preacher said quietly. Hawk nodded. "Yeah, they did." And somewhere in a concrete cell 40 miles from the border, Sebastian Dawson sat waiting. unaware that the machinery of the United States military was beginning to turn, slowly and inevitably, toward the man who'd put him there. Maria Gonzalez had worked at the Laredo South Detention Center for 6 years, long enough to recognize the difference between the guilty and the unlucky. She'd processed hundreds of people through these halls, maybe thousands. Families separated at the border, migrant workers who'd overstayed visas, kids who'd been brought here as infants and knew no other home. Most days, she went through the motions, stamped the forms, and tried not to think too hard about where these people ended up. But today was different. She was filing intake paperwork when she saw the name. Dawson, Sebastian J. The file was thin, barely started, which meant he'd only been here a few hours. Detained by Agent Rowley on suspicion of illegal entry, no valid documentation. She'd seen that phrase 100 times, usually attached to people who genuinely had no papers or whose documents were questionable. But something made her pull the file. Maybe it was the military bearing she'd noticed when they'd brought him through processing. Maybe it was the dog tags he'd refused to surrender. Maybe it was just instinct. She opened the file and started reading. Then she stopped, read it again, and felt her stomach drop. There was a photocopy of his military ID, the one Rowley had dismissed as fake. But Maria's brother was Army, stationed at Fort Hood, and she knew what a real military ID looked like. The holographic seal, the embedded chip, the specific font and layout that changed every few years to prevent forgery. This wasn't fake, this was legitimate. She pulled up the database, the one connected to the Department of Defense personnel records, or typed in his name and service number from the ID, hit enter. The screen populated with information that made her hands start shaking. Dawson, Sebastian James, active duty, Navy Special Warfare, 17 years of service, multiple deployments, and then a section that was almost entirely redacted, black bars covering everything except the words classified and a clearance level that made her breath catch. She looked around the office. Her supervisor was on a phone call, his back turned. The other clerks were busy with their own files. No one was watching. Maria pulled out her phone and took a picture of the screen. Then another of the military ID. Then one of the intake form with Rowley's signature at the bottom, the one that said no valid documentation in his aggressive scrawl. Her hands were still shaking when she opened her messages and scrolled to a contact she hadn't used in months. David Reyes, reporter for the Laredo Morning Times. They'd gone to high school together, stayed in touch through Facebook and the occasional coffee. He'd given her his number 2 years ago, told her if she ever saw something at the facility that didn't sit right, something the public should know about, she should call him. She'd never called. Until now. The message was simple. I have something you need to see. Can you meet me on my lunch break? The reply came back in 30 seconds. When and where? An hour later, Maria sat in her car in the parking lot of a Whataburger 3 blocks from the detention center. David slid into the passenger seat, his reporter's notebook already out, his phone recording. This better be good, Maria. I've got a city council meeting in an hour. She handed him her phone, the photos already pulled up. It's better than good. It's a nightmare. David looked at the first photo, then the second, then the third. His expression shifted from curious to shocked to something that looked like anger. Holy shit. That's a Navy SEAL, Maria said quietly. Active duty. Just got back from deployment, and Rowley threw him in a cell because he decided the ID was fake. Did he verify it? There's no record of any verification, no calls to DOD, no database checks, nothing. He just decided it was fake and processed him like any other detainee. David was already typing on his phone, his fingers flying. Does anyone else know about this? Not yet, but they will. Our military's probably already looking for him. Then we need to move fast. David looked up, his eyes sharp. You're sure about this? Once this goes public, there's no taking it back. Rowley's going to know someone leaked it. Maria thought about Sebastian sitting in that cell, his dog tags around his neck, his calm voice telling frightened people to breathe. She thought about her brother, who wore the same uniform, who could just as easily be the one detained by some agent who couldn't see past the colour of his skin. I'm sure. David nodded and opened his laptop. Give me 20 minutes. 18 minutes later, the story went live on the Laredo Morning Times website. The headline was simple and devastating. Navy SEAL detained by ICE despite valid military credentials. The article included the photos Maria had taken, carefully cropped to hide any identifying information about her. It included quotes from military law experts about the protocols for verifying service members. It included Rowley's name and his history of complaints that had never quite stuck. Within an hour, it had been picked up by the AP wire. Within 2 hours, it was trending on Twitter. Within 3, news vans were pulling into the detention center parking lot, and Maria was watching from her desk as her supervisor's phone started ringing off the hook. She didn't feel guilty. She felt like she'd finally done something that mattered. The first Humvee arrived at 1600 hours, rolling into the detention center parking lot with the kind of purpose that made people stop and stare. The second followed 30 seconds later, then a third, then a fourth. By the time the convoy finished assembling, there were 6 military vehicles arranged in a precise formation that blocked the main entrance, their engines still running, their presence impossible to ignore. Colonel Richard Vance stepped out of the lead vehicle, his uniform crisp despite the Texas heat, his jaw set in a way that suggested he was holding back something volcanic. Behind him came a full bird captain, 2 JAG officers with briefcases, and a master chief whose chest candy told the story of 3 decades in Naval Special Warfare. They moved like a unit, synchronized and lethal in their efficiency. The news crews that had been camped outside the facility for the past hour scrambled to reposition their cameras. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors thumping against the sky. This wasn't a quiet diplomatic extraction. This was a show of force. Inside the facility, Agent William Rowley was in his supervisor's office, trying to explain for the 3rd time why he hadn't verified the military ID. His supervisor, District Director Patricia Kemp, sat behind her desk with her fingers pressed to her temples like she was trying to physically hold her skull together. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that you detained an active duty Navy SEAL with TS/SCI clearance, threw his credentials in the dirt and didn't think to run a single verification check?" "The ID looked fake," Rowley insisted. "I've seen dozens of fake military IDs. This one had all the hallmarks. It had all the hallmarks because it was real, you idiot." Kemp's phone buzzed for the 15th time. She ignored it. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you have any concept of the shitstorm that's about to—" The door to her office opened without a knock. Her assistant stood there, pale and wide-eyed. "Ma'am, there's a Colonel Vance here to see you. He has 6 vehicles and about 20 personnel outside. He says he's not leaving without Petty Officer Dawson." Kemp closed her eyes. "Send him in." Colonel Vance didn't wait for an invitation. He walked into the office like he owned it, his eyes sweeping over Rowley with the kind of disdain usually reserved for enemy combatants. The JAG officers flanked him, their briefcases hitting the desk with synchronized thuds. "Director Kemp," Vance said, while his voice clipped and military precise. "I'm here to retrieve one of my men, Petty Officer Sebastian Dawson. You're holding him illegally." Kemp stood, trying to reclaim some authority. "Colonel, I understand your concern, but we have protocols." "Protocols?" Vance's voice didn't rise, but it cut like a blade. "Your agent detained a service member with active clearances without verification, without cause, and without following any protocol that exists in federal law. That's not a protocol violation. That's kidnapping." Rowley stepped forward, his face flushed. "Now wait just a minute. I had reasonable suspicion." Vance turned to him, and Rowley actually took a step back. "Ooh, you're Agent Rowley." "That's right. You're the one who threw a military ID in the dirt and called it fake." "It looked fake. Did you verify it?" Rowley's jaw worked. "I didn't need to. I know a fake when I—" "That's a no." Vance turned back to Kemp. "Director, I'm going to make this very simple. You have two options. Option 1. You release Petty Officer Dawson into my custody immediately, and we handle this through official channels. Option 2. I make a phone call to the Secretary of Defense, who will make a phone call to the Secretary of Homeland Security, and within the hour, this facility will be swarming with federal marshals and military police. Your choice." Kemp looked at Rowley, then back at Vance. The calculation was visible on her face. Pride versus pragmatism. Authority versus survival. "I'll have him brought up," she said quietly. "Now." "Now," she confirmed, reaching for her phone. Rowley's face went from red to purple. "You can't just let them waltz in here and—" "Agent Rowley," Kemp said, her voice dead calm. "You are suspended effective immediately. Badge and weapon on my desk, now." "What? You can't—" "I can and I am. You've created an interagency incident that's going to take months to untangle. You've embarrassed this department on national television, and you've illegally detained a decorated war hero because you couldn't be bothered to do your job. Badge, weapon, now." Outside, the news cameras captured everything. The military convoy, the officers standing at attention. The way the detention center staff moved with sudden urgency, like someone had kicked an anthill. And in the cell, our Sebastian heard the door unlock for the first time in 9 hours. A guard stood there, looking uncomfortable. "Dawson, you're being released." Sebastian stood slowly, his wrists still sore from the cuffs. Around him, the other detainees watched with expressions ranging from hope to envy to resignation. "What about them?" Sebastian asked, nodding to the others. The guard shifted. "That's not— I'm just here for you." Sebastian looked at the faces around him. The crying woman, the teenage boy, the old man who'd been praying. "Then I'm not done here yet." Sebastian walked down the hallway flanked by 2 guards, his dog tags catching the fluorescent light with each step. His wrists ached where the cuffs had bitten into skin, and his back was stiff from 9 hours on a concrete floor, but his stride was steady and his head was high. He could hear raised voices ahead, coming from the direction of the front office. When he rounded the corner into the reception area, he understood why. The room had transformed into a war zone of bureaucratic tension. Colonel Vance stood near the front desk in full uniform, flanked by JAG officers and a Master Chief, whose face Sebastian recognized immediately. Master Chief Williams had been his instructor at BUD/S, the man who'd pushed him through Hell Week when his body had wanted to quit. Behind them, visible through the glass doors, was a convoy that looked like it was ready to invade a small country. And standing between the military and the exit, red-faced and trembling with rage, was Agent William Rowley. "I don't care what rank you hold," Rowley was saying, his voice pitched high and tight. "This is a federal immigration facility, and I have jurisdiction over every person in this building. You can't just storm in here and—" "Agent Rowley," Colonel Vance's voice was ice over steel. "You are currently suspended. You have no jurisdiction over anything except the walk to your car." "That's bullshit. Director Kemp can't suspend me without—" "I absolutely can," Kemp said from behind her office door, which she'd left open specifically so her voice would carry. "And I did. You're done, Rowley. Rowley spun toward Sebastian, his eyes wild. You think you're special? Like you think because you've got some fancy friends you can just walk out of here? I detained you legally, and you're not going anywhere until I say. You detained him illegally, one of the JAG officers interrupted, flipping open her briefcase and pulling out a document. Under Title 10 of the U.S. Code, active duty military personnel are subject to military jurisdiction. You had no authority to detain Petty Officer Dawson without first verifying his status with the Department of Defense. Furthermore, under the Real ID Act, military identification cards are considered valid federal identification. You dismissed valid federal ID without verification, which constitutes unlawful detention. Rowley's mouth opened and closed. He looked suspicious. I had reasonable suspicion to... Reasonable suspicion of what? Master Chief Williams stepped forward, and despite being 3 inches shorter than Rowley, he somehow made the agent look small. Driving while black? That's what this was, wasn't it? You saw a black man in a nice truck and decided he didn't belong. That's not... I don't... Rowley's face was the color of a ripe tomato. This is about immigration enforcement, not race. Then why didn't you verify his ID? Vance asked. Standard protocol when someone presents military identification is to run it through the Defense Enrollment Eligibility Reporting System. Takes 90 seconds. Why didn't you do that? Rowley's jaw worked, but no sound came out. Sebastian spoke for the first time, his voice calm and clear. Because he'd already decided what I was before I opened my mouth. But the ID didn't matter. The truth didn't matter. He saw what he wanted to see. That's a lie, Rowley snapped, but his voice cracked on the last word. Is it? Sebastian took a step forward. The guards beside him tensed, but didn't stop him. You threw my ID in the dirt, called it a cheap forgery, told me I probably bought it at a surplus store. You didn't run it, didn't call it in, didn't verify a single thing. You just decided I was guilty and worked backward from there. I was doing my job. Your job is to enforce immigration law, not to profile American citizens. Sebastian's voice didn't rise, but it filled the room. I've spent 17 years defending this country. I've bled for it. I've watched brothers die for it. And today, I got thrown in a cage by a man who thinks the color of my skin makes me less American than he is. The room went silent. Even the phones had stopped ringing. Through the glass doors, Sebastian could see the news cameras, their lenses pointed directly at this moment. Rowley looked around, seeming to realize for the first time that he was surrounded. His supervisor had turned against him. The military had arrived in force. The media was watching, and the man he'd dismissed as a nobody was standing in front of him with the kind of quiet authority that couldn't be faked. This isn't over, Rowley said, but it sounded hollow even to him. Yes, Colonel Vance said quietly. It is. Director Kemp, we're taking Petty Officer Dawson into our custody. You'll be hearing from the Department of Defense regarding this incident. Kemp nodded, looking like she'd aged 10 years in the past hour. Understood, Colonel. Vance turned to Sebastian. Let's go home, Petty Officer. Sebastian nodded, but before he moved, he turned back to look at the hallway that led to the cells, at the people still waiting there, still hoping for someone to see them as human. What about them? He asked. Vance followed his gaze. That's not our fight today. Maybe it should be. The automatic doors slid open, and Sebastian stepped into the late afternoon sun. The heat hit him first, dry and unforgiving, but after 9 hours of recycled air and fluorescent lights, it felt like freedom. He paused at the top of the steps, his dog tags resting against his chest, his posture straight despite the exhaustion that pulled at his bones. The parking lot had transformed into a media circus. News vans lined the perimeter, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like flowers seeking sun. Cameras swiveled toward him, red recording lights blinking in unison. Reporters surged forward against the barricade that military police had established, shouting questions that blurred into white noise. Sebastian didn't rush. He walked down the steps with the same measured pace he'd use on a patrol in hostile territory, unaware that every eye was on him, every camera capturing this moment. Behind him, Colonel Vance and Master Chief Williams flanked him like an honor guard, their presence a silent statement that the United States Navy stood with their own. "Petty Officer Dawson, can you tell us what happened? Were you mistreated inside? Is this about racial profiling?" Sebastian stopped at the bottom of the steps. Vance put a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that said he didn't have to answer, didn't owe these people anything. But Sebastian had spent 17 years in the shadows, doing work that would never make headlines, protecting people who would never know his name. Maybe it was time to step into the light. He turned toward the cameras. "My name is Sebastian Dawson," he said, his voice carrying across the parking lot without needing to shout. "I'm a petty officer first class in the United States Navy SEALs. I've served my country for 17 years in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and other places I'm not authorized to name. This morning, I was driving home from deployment when I was pulled over by an ICE agent who decided my military ID was fake. He didn't verify it, he didn't call it in, he just decided I didn't look like I belonged, and he threw me in a cell." The reporters had gone quiet, their recorders thrust forward to catch every word. "I'm not angry," Sebastian continued, and he realized as he said it that it was true. Anger had burned out somewhere around hour 6 in that cell, replaced by something colder and more useful. "I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed that in 2024, a decorated service member can be detained on American soil because an agent couldn't see past the color of his skin. I'm disappointed that the system failed not just me, but every person still sitting in that facility who doesn't have a military convoy to come get them." Behind him, through the glass doors, movement caught his eye. Agent Rowley had emerged from the building, his face still flushed, his hands gesturing wildly as he argued with Director Kemp. 2 security officers stood nearby, waiting. Sebastian didn't point, didn't need to. The cameras had already found their secondary target. "But I'm also grateful," Sebastian said, drawing attention back to himself. "Grateful for my brothers and sisters in uniform, who moved heaven and earth to find me. I'm grateful for the people inside that facility who knew this was wrong and had the courage to speak up. And grateful that we live in a country where this kind of injustice can't stay hidden, where the truth eventually comes to light." Kemp's voice carried across the parking lot, sharp and final. "Agent Rowley, your badge and weapon, now!" The cameras swiveled, capturing the moment. Rowley's hands went to his belt, moving with the jerky reluctance of a man who knew his career was ending in real time. He unclipped his badge, then his service weapon, handing them over to one of the security officers with a violence that was barely contained. "This is bullshit," Rowley's voice cracked across the distance. "I was doing my job. I was protecting. You were protecting your ego," Kemp said, loud enough that the microphones caught it. You're done, Rowley. Security will escort you to your vehicle." The security officers moved in, one on each side. Rowley tried to shake them off, but they held firm, guiding him toward the employee parking area. He looked back once, his eyes finding Sebastian across the distance, and the hatred there was pure and undiluted. Sebastian met his gaze and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Master Chief Williams stepped up beside him. "Hell of a day, Petty Officer." "Yes, Master Chief." "How you holding up?" Sebastian thought about the question. About the 9 hours in the cell, about the people still inside, about the fact that he'd been treated like a criminal in the country he'd bled for. "I've had worse, Master Chief." Williams nodded, a small smile tugging at his mouth. That you have? Come on, well, let's get you debriefed and home. Sebastian took one last look at the detention centre, at the concrete walls and razor wire, at the windows where faces might be watching. Then he turned and walked toward the convoy, toward his brothers in arms, toward whatever came next. The cameras followed him all the way to the Humvee, and in living rooms across America, people watched a Navy SEAL walk free while the man who detained him was stripped of his badge and escorted away in disgrace. The image would run on every news channel for the next week, but Sebastian wouldn't see it. He'd be too busy planning his next mission. 6 months later, Sebastian sat in a conference room in the Rayburn House office building, waiting to testify before the House Committee on Homeland Security. Through the window, he could see the Capitol dome rising against a grey November sky, its white stone somehow both imposing and fragile. He'd been in war zones that felt less intimidating than this room with its mahogany panels and congressional seals. His lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen, who'd taken his case pro bono after the story broke, sat beside him reviewing notes. Remember, keep your answers direct. Don't let them bait you into political statements. You're here as an expert witness on military-civilian law enforcement protocols, nothing more. Sebastian nodded, adjusting his dress uniform. The Navy had insisted he wear it for the testimony, and he understood why. The ribbons on his chest told a story that words couldn't, each coloured bar representing blood and sacrifice, and missions that would never be declassified. He was here not just as Sebastian Dawson, but as a symbol of every service member who'd ever been failed by the system they'd sworn to protect. The hearing room doors opened, and an aide gestured them forward. Sebastian stood, his movements precise, and walked into a space filled with cameras, reporters, and congressional representatives who looked at him with expressions ranging from sympathy to calculation. He took his seat at the witness table, placed his hands flat on the surface, and waited. Chairman Rodriguez gavelled the session to order. This committee recognizes Petty Officer First Class Sebastian Dawson, United States Navy SEALs. Petty Officer Dawson, thank you for your service and for agreeing to testify today regarding the events of May 15th and recommendations for protocol reform. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the next 2 hours, Sebastian walked them through it. The traffic stop, the dismissal of his credentials, the 9 hours in detention. He kept his voice level, his facts precise, his emotions in check. But when Representative Martinez from Texas asked him what he thought should change, Sebastian leaned forward. With respect, Congressman, the problem isn't just protocol, it's culture. Agent Rowley had the tools to verify my identity in 90 seconds. He chose not to use them because he'd already decided who I was based on what I looked like. You can write all the protocols you want, but until we address the bias that makes agents see American citizens as threats, once we're just rearranging deck chairs. The room went quiet. Chairman Rodriguez cleared his throat. And what would you recommend? Mandatory verification of all military IDs, no exceptions. Real consequences for agents who fail to follow procedure. And an independent review board for detention cases involving veterans or active duty personnel. We trust service members with our nation's security. The least we can do is trust them when they say who they are. The testimony made headlines that night, but Sebastian was already thinking about the next step. 3 weeks later, he stood in a small office in downtown Detroit, looking at the freshly painted sign on the door. The Dawson Foundation, Legal Defense for Detained Veterans. The settlement from his lawsuit against ICE had been substantial, on 7 figures that the government had paid quietly to avoid further embarrassment. Sebastian had kept enough to secure his daughter's college fund and donated the rest to this. Maria Gonzalez, the woman who'd leaked his story, had agreed to serve as the foundation's first case manager. She stood beside him now, holding a tablet that showed their website, which had gone live that morning. "We've already got 43 requests for assistance," she said, scrolling through the messages. "Veterans detained at the border, service members harassed during traffic stops, one Marine who was held for 6 hours because the officer didn't believe Camp Pendleton was a real base." Sebastian read over her shoulder, his jaw tightening with each case. "We help all of them. Oh, every single one. We don't have the resources to. Then we find the resources. We get more lawyers, more funding, whatever it takes." He looked at her. "You risked your career to help me. I'm not going to let that mean nothing." The Foundation's first case went to trial in January. A retired Army Ranger who'd been detained for 14 hours despite presenting valid ID. Sebastian sat in the courtroom every day, his presence a silent reminder that these cases mattered, that someone was watching. They won. As for William Rowley, his trial had concluded 2 weeks earlier. Federal charges of civil rights violations, unlawful detention, and falsification of records. The jury had deliberated for 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts, and he was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison and permanent disqualification from law enforcement. Sebastian hadn't attended the sentencing. He'd been too busy reviewing applications for the Foundation's new scholarship program, designed to help veterans pursue law degrees so they could fight these battles from the inside. On a cold December evening, Sebastian stood at Arlington National Cemetery, visiting the grave of a teammate who hadn't made it home from their last deployment. He placed a hand on the cold marble headstone and spoke quietly. "We're still fighting, brother. Just a different battlefield now." His phone buzzed. A text from Maria. "Just got word. Congress passed the Military ID Verification Act. Mandatory verification. Independent review board. Everything you asked for." Sebastian read the message twice, then looked back at the headstone. "We're winning," he said. And for the first time in 6 months, he smiled. So, what do you think? Was 18 months enough for Agent Rowley, or should he have faced harsher consequences for what he put Sebastian and countless others through? And could you have turned your pain into purpose the way Sebastian did, using his settlement to defend others instead of walking away? Let me know in the comments below. If this story of injustice, courage, and fighting for what's right moved you, hit that like button. It really helps us share more stories like this. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that matters. And remember, true patriotism isn't just serving your country abroad. It's fighting for justice at home. Stay blessed.